I think I've been fortunate to shake most of your hands at this point, but in case we haven't met, I'm Genevieve Shea, the Budapest-based program director for the Central Europe Civic Engagement Program, under which NDI and IPA organized this conference. You know, when designing the agenda, it was our goal to have a session in which we would reflect a little bit on what we discussed today and how to really take it forward. And it was, you know, with anticipation that we thought that we would come up with all these new ideas and present all these new strategies, and hear the thing that we hear frequently, which is we'd love to do it, but we don't have the money. And so I actually want to give everyone credit in this room, because I think of all these conferences I've attended, I've heard that repeated the least in the last 2 days. And in fact, we've just really met a lot of enthusiasm for new strategies. And the discussions have been really fruitful and forward-looking. So thank you all for that and your optimism in this conversation. But anyways, this is the final panel of the conference, and we are calling it the donor perspective. And we would like to reflect a little bit on those conversations that we've had today and what it takes to get there. So it is my pleasure to introduce our guests. In order, we have Balázs Járbek from Dexys Consulting Group on the end, Eva Kulik-Bilinska from Battery Foundation here in Poland, and next to me, Chris Abrams from USAID. And while we're calling this the donor perspective, I'm not sure that the three folks next to me would describe themselves as donors. And so before we get started, I did just want to give them 3 minutes to quickly introduce what their relationship to grant making is, so that you can kind of understand the position from which they come. And I think we only have one microphone, so if I can go in order.
Yeah, thank you. And definitely we are an implementer, not a donor. The donor is sitting here from my perspective. By all means, it's USAID. Dexys is brand new to the region, but I have been working on for USAID implementers in Eastern Europe for about 15 years, managing large-scale projects. This one is much smaller, and therefore it's really a different kind of challenge, and I will speak about it later, but that's kind of my own personal experience. Thank you.
Thank you. Stefan Battery Foundation is a grant-making organization. We are a grant maker. We are not a donor, we are not an implementer, but we really specialize in supporting civil society, democracy, and rule of law with grants, first of all, but not only. And we've been around already for 35 years. We have our own funds that we managed to raise over the years. We built an endowment, so we are a little bit independent in the portion of what we do. But we also are a fundraising organization. We apply for grants in order to distribute these grants to the civil society, so in Poland, but also in some countries east of Poland. So in a way, we are also an intermediary. But an important thing for us is we never run programs, but we do not design ourselves. So the guidelines can be there in the framework offered by what you call donors, but it's us who are the authors and designers. And the programs we run have to be in line with our strategies and priorities.
Hello, everyone. I got to welcome you yesterday for a bit. I'm Chris Abrams. I'm with the U.S. Agency for International Development. My official title is the Senior Development Advisor for Central Europe. And this is USAID's sort of beginning to return to Central Europe in the region. For a long time, the assumption is that our programs and operations really should not work in EU countries, but then of course a few years ago some of the discussions have changed on that, and I think internally in the US government we are still trying to work on what that means for Central Europe writ large. And I guess maybe I would note, so USAID obviously is the development arm of the US government, and we have programs all over the world, and a big presence in Ukraine and the Western Balkans and the Caucasus, a much smaller presence here in Central Europe. We give out grants to organizations like Dexys or Battery or others in different ways that a lot of times give those grants or sub-grants or micro-grants out to others. We also run programs and contracts. We also work for people, so one of my jobs is to raise funds in a way, but this is with the United States Interagency and sort of our process with Congress and how we can bring attention to those issues that are important and need to have more resources.
Thank you. Just a bit of history about the event that we're all attending is that NDI's program that we institute with IPA was designed to foster networks, support collective action, and really encourage coalition building and partnerships among civil society organizations in the region. And so that's why we've brought you all here today. It is very much our mission to support those strategic and collective partnerships. But one of the challenges I've heard from folks that we work with is this concern that if we bring on more people, if we bring on more partners, we then face these restrictions of or feedback that there's too much operational costs, that we can't afford to have 3 or 4 program managers coming onto a project. At the same time, we see calls for applications that require those sorts of partnerships. And so I wonder how grant makers are viewing that, maybe a little bit of tension between wanting to see partnerships and coalitions come along, but seeing as well additional operational costs come into those proposals. And maybe for this first round we'll go in order, but otherwise can, or not. All right.
Yes, so a few, regarding the technicalities, a few observations from my end. Indeed, I mean, first of all, you know, we originally thought about this as a regional program. We have 3 different countries, Hungary, Poland, Bulgaria, and we very quickly find out that this is not going to work as a regional program because all these countries are different, the challenges for civil society is different, the resources are very different, and as well the approaches of the civil society organizations are different too. Well, we wanted to put them obviously into the same basket as originally the thinking was. We quickly find out that this is not going to be the case. Second, in a lot of aspects, for those organizations we are working with, these are the largest civil society organizations in the region. In a lot of respect, they have more resources we do. So the challenge was really to find where we can be useful, where the funding should be concentrated. And you know, in a few cases, particularly in Poland, it wasn't very difficult. In other countries like Hungary, it was actually a bit more. Simply because the mindset, the context, and all this were very different. When we arrived to Poland, the NGOs were in full mobilization mode before the elections. In Hungary, there was a lot of survival still, for example, which has obvious repercussions on how they're approaching, for example, resources. The other issue is that, at least it's my obvious personal opinion, that I found resource management at least that important as resource generation. For a lot of NGOs, I think, I myself coming from a small NGO back 25 years ago and then went up, so you know, I was doing my own step up gradually. So I do see that these organizations, this is a constant learning, right? So a lot more management issues can be dealt with by mentoring, advice, and all this, not necessarily funding-wise. But obviously funding and institutional funding is always the first thing which any organizations would ask. This is what I used to do as well myself. When it comes to cost, I mean, I found this is one of the big advantage for USAID as well as its implementers, that they can be much more flexible, despite the US government rules are not necessarily are. But this is kind of our role, and I have to confess that at Dexys we also had to learn on our own mistakes, what is viable and what is not, how to make it, the funding schemes and all this much more flexible, particularly for the smaller organizations than for the bigger organizations. And for the big organizations, we have been doing organizational assessments simply to see how the management actually of these are doing. And once we're finding the common understanding, then it's much easier to do the management advice. And I think this is the phase we are at, but particularly with the big organizations in both Poland and Hungary. Shut up here.
I think for this first round, we can just come down the line.
You know, for me, I mean, I don't understand why you think that funding coalition can be more difficult or more expensive than funding individual organizations. I believe it's the contrary. It's much cheaper because you give one grant to a bunch of organizations, and the admin costs are comparative to the cost of the single organizations. And instead of having 12 different organizations being funded with admin costs, you fund only one. The reason why, and this is something I would like to congratulate you on, that you decided to fund coalitions. Because coalition could, I would say, like solidarity could be my middle name. Because I believe that, especially in the difficult times, when, and the times what we had in Poland for the last 8 years, and that Hungary has had for 12 years. And actually Hungary was for us a model, an example to follow with the first 2 coalitions that were very important, and one was civilization, and the other one was the coalition for fundraising for charitable causes. I mean, in these times, I mean, especially when you have very few resources that you have to share, you have to build solidarity and coalition in order to have an impact and influence, and also, especially in advocacy work, to earn legitimacy and credibility. In advocacy, when you advocate as a single organization, what is your legitimacy except for your strong beliefs that you are right? If you have others who share this view, your voice is much stronger, you are much more visible, and you have much bigger credit, also vis-à-vis the decision makers. So coalitions are more effective than single organizations in the advocacy issues. They are more effective in gaining the support and visibility in the public opinion. And they are more effective in learning and sharing resources. I'm so happy that we've had so many wonderful coalitions in this project, which really could prove the very successful track record and what they have been doing for the past 8 years. Because the other thing was that they learned that instead of competing, and this was a DNA of the civil society organizations in our countries, instead of competing for grants, they pool resources for, to learn from each other, and in a very effective way manage these resources to achieve greater impact. And the most visible example of that was, all these different coalitions that were working during the last parliamentary elections, and before that, starting with the last presidential elections, that really it was due to them, due to the civil society, and not the work of the politicians, including our Prime Minister, that we finally managed to avert this illiberal democracy trend in Poland, and that people went to the polls in such great numbers. Thank you.
Hi. Well, I guess I would note from the USAID perspective, because I think one of the big challenges, we always talk about it internally, I've been talking about it almost my entire career, is how you can have money and you can have an organization, say, a very small organization down there, and how it can be very difficult just to get a small amount of money into the hands of a smaller organization from, the level of the U.S. government, and then maybe with another partner, and then go forward, and all the transaction costs that happen in between there, to the extent where you're like, well, if we can give a $10,000 grant to this small organization, it may cost us like $30,000, right? Because of all the people that are in the way, not in the way, but that are required to move forward on that process. But I think that your question on program costs versus actual implementation or those kinds of things, I think a lot of that can be solved with clarity of objective. I know it's a very difficult thing to do, particularly in sort of the democracy space. But once there's a sort of a momentum of achievement, right? Then, and you can demonstrate that achievement, then I don't think anyone really is paying attention to how that achievement is being accomplished. And then you'd have to ask yourself, okay, so, but in terms of what you could achieve, and whether or not your sort of bureaucratic structure is spending so much time on the paperwork that the achievement of results is so much smaller. Could you achieve more if you were more effective or more efficient? For me, I know that we're not going to be able to change the regulatory system in the United States, as we give out aid, right? But what both can kind of factor in is what they're doing, right? So if those program costs or the cost for the management of those programs can be tied to that achievement of the objective, right? Then I think everyone is fine with paying those costs, right? And then of course, if that objective is being achieved, then that gives a really good argument for us to get more money, right? And the money, a lot of times it's all interconnected, I guess, in some ways or another. I guess I would, so as an example, I'll just note the resources for the Central Europe region were an earmark from Congress. It was like $20 million a year. In the earmark, there are 11 categories of things that money can be used for. It was split across 3 roughly different organizations in the US government. One of those organizations was all the embassies in Central Europe, right? So now you're looking at 8 embassies, DRL, USAID. And then in USAID, we focused on 3 thematic areas, but 6 partners over 7 countries. And then that's just that's that level, right? And then each of those partners, doing what they're supposed to do, works to give micro grants at the lower level, right? And so now we're working with, you know, somewhere around 500, 600 different organizations in Central Europe, which is great, right? My job is to figure out how to take that 600 organizations and what's going on with a range of issues, right? From LGBTQI to, you know, like Roma, vulnerable populations, to rule of law, to advocacy, and try to, independent media, and try to sum that up into some form of objective achieved. Does that make any sense, right? And so there is and the challenge is, in the US government, is where the attention span is, right? And so I always think about this kind of Beastie Boys song a lot, which is, you know, it's like, get it together. The United States government is almost like a nervous organism, right? And, you know, they have a war in Ukraine, oh my God, what's going on in Gaza? What's happening here? You know, you know. And you almost have to make them slightly nervous about what's happening in Central Europe, right? You know, hey, this is a national security priority. And I know that seems like bizarre, but it is, right? I mean, what's happening in Hungary directly affects our NATO relationships and our achievement in Ukraine. You know, having a strong partner in Poland helps overall stability of Central Europe. I mean, there's a million different ways to look at this, but how do you connect that down to a $10,000 grant that was given to X organization in Bulgaria? Becomes like this big challenge. And so, anyways, so there's that aspect of achievement of objective, you know, and I think you could say, yeah, well, the important thing is to juice, you know, kind of get money out into the system, have civil society survive, in some cases, have civil society thrive, in others, maybe the other way to look at it is how do we, you know, open the space. But this achievement, when you have sort of democratic backsliding, and you're providing funding, and that backsliding continues, right, it gets even more difficult to demonstrate achievement, right? Because you're like, well, we're putting money into the space, and the space keeps shrinking. And because the space keeps shrinking, we need to have more money for the, you know, for the space. But how do you, you know, it's really hard to square it all together. Maybe this last point on the costs. So if you do that, right, if you have an earmark, and then, so my boss, the assistant administrator for Europe and Eurasia, goes to Congress, and she's like, okay, so what have you done on this, you know, with the roughly $10 million a year that USAID has been spending in Central Europe? And she has to come up with like 2 things or 3 things, right? And she has to demonstrate progress in a closing environment, right? So, and then, you know, obviously Congress will get much more time, right? They can ask many more questions, they can pontificate about, oh, well, you know, USAID and development assistance is ridiculous. Why are you in the EU? What are you doing? You know, all that kind of thing. But we have to kind of link it to almost directly to the United States national interest. On the other hand, she can never go into the complication of the 11 priorities, 3 thematic areas, 6 partners, you know, 7 countries, and then, you know, the 500, you know, small grants or whatever it may be. But each level of that costs a lot of time and transaction. And I think it kind of, we get so busy trying to get these grants out the door that we just want to get the grants out. But then we're not really thinking about how that all comes together into some kind of, you know, at least definable or achievable objective. And so, and I think the cost is not so much the money as it is the message and the impact of the work that everybody's doing, something of that nature.
Thanks, and I think you know, highlight an important distinction on impacts that might give way to my next question. But prior to this session, we had 2 working groups. In this room, we had folks talking about SLAPs and what's that meant for their operations. And downstairs we had a group of you all speaking about burnout and staff initiatives that are needed within civil society to sort of help support and strengthen its own resilience. And so I guess my question can be taken from sort of either angle, but from the funding perspective, you know, how are donors viewing investments in things such as you know, burnout initiatives or other staff initiatives, and reserves for things like legal support or other pots of money that maybe aren't as distinctly tied to activities. And then I guess the other side of the coin is just how do we tell the story that civil society and the strength of civil society is the investment and is worthy, maybe absent of its immediate achievements. Ava, if I can put you on the spot to start.
I think I will link it with what has been said before, because I think it's important, and this, when the donors and grant makers define their priorities and what they perceive as the objective of their grant making, is really what you define, and so, you know, in the countries in which the civil society is under threat and the civic space is shrinking, what you define as the achievement. Is it necessarily progress, or is it the fact that civil society is resisting the threats and is fighting against it? Is it about progress and achievement, or is it about resilience? That the civil society is building resilience and is constantly on the fight, not only reactively but proactively. In Poland, we have, you know, many examples of reactive activity of the civil society. You have some of the coalitions here, including SLS for Education or our spokesperson. But there are also more, many more. I mean, really, it was civil society that was, for example, at the core of the initiative to organize several public hearings that really managed to not make change completely the situation, but to slow down the anti-democratic processes in many different spheres, including the civic space. It was the civil society work that for almost a year managed to stop the National Institute of Freedom Act. It was civil society that managed to organize a public hearing on the National Recovery and Resilience Plan and really contributed to changing it and to making it a big issue. So, so I think important is how you define your objective in this very difficult circumstances. Because when you help the civil society to survive, to continue to work, then when the moment comes of, you know, many different kind of factors working, you have actors then, and this means, this hard work means a lot of stress, exhaustion, burnout, and this is the way. This is exactly the role of the donors, to notice it and to come with a support program. I think 2 years ago we had a meeting of donors and implementers in Battery Foundation devoted exactly for working out mechanisms to support human rights activists and civil society organization activists working in difficult situations, in difficult circumstances, working under stress and working basically constantly for years under attack of right-wing forces, the government, you name it. And the idea was to really focus and to pool resources to provide a comprehensive, extensive program that would include supporting organizations that are offering this kind of support, who are really professionalizing it. In Poland, we have only one that trains others how to provide support to counteract anti-burnout, and if burnout happens, then to help these people get out of it. You know, creating the programs for civil society organization activists to go on sabbatical, on, you know, relief break, and creating a spaces in which they can have such such an opportunity to undergo, serious kind of psychological treatment, to have money for psychiatrists, to have money for supervision, to have to think about the well-being of the activists and not only activists but also the even grant-making organizations are providing grants to these people because they are also under stress. So I think it should be like an important part of the grant-making that would give money not for activities only, but you give money for capacity building, that you give money for the well-being of the civil society organization employees and volunteers, and that you are not thinking only in the terms of how much it costs and what are their salaries. Yeah, you should think about the salaries, they should be higher. You shouldn't question why are they so high, because they are never high. They are always under what is at the market, and that they can never compete with the money that you can get in business. And also talking about effectiveness, I think it's important thing to see that maybe it's time not to ask organizations to report on how much they spend in each kind of line budget, but what is the effect that they made with this money. So this is something that we've been proposing already for some time, and we experimented with it also with public funds, Norwegian public funds that we received. That is results-based approach for grant making. We do not ask you what is your precise budget. We ask you what you want to achieve and what time, what are going to be the milestones. Flexibility from the point of view of grant making, because the situation changes so rapidly that yes, you've had some objectives when you started, but then the situation changed. You have to somehow address this changing situation. So to allow them to be in the constant dialogue with the grantees and to allow to amend and adopt to the new situation and to adjust to it. Important, even to change the objective. If it's still in line with kind of general outcome. Because we do not ask business how much they pay the people for the salaries, how much they pay for electricity. We deal with them, yes, you want a hospital with 100 beds, and how much it's going to cost. And did you provide this 100 beds for this cost? And this is kind of approach we should also have when we are dealing with the organizations. What do you want to achieve? What are the indicators? And then we are not asking you how much you paid, how many people employed. Important thing is, that have you had this effect?
Polish.
Yeah. Thank you. I very much agree on the perspective, and I would also add that it's also kind of depending on the context. For example, there is a major war ongoing a few hundred kilometers from here, which is obviously have a direct repercussions on closing societies. Do we really expect in the next few years that there's going to be an opening society? Right? I don't think so. No matter what the NGOs or how much funding we're actually going to do, that's now the context, which whether we like it or not, it's going to be very, very hard to change, unless obviously something major surprise happening in the war or some, but sure. But that's kind of the trend, and that's the context which we are living in. It's very much, if I contrast where I started to work in civil society organizations in the 90s, oh my God, the context was very different, much more positive in terms of overheating. So that is also very important to factor in. Second, and part of the context is, for example, the issue of foreign funding, the political interference, and how much politically sensitive, for example, to work on USAID-funded projects now, whether we again like it or not. This is also part of the context, and we have to factor in the political sensitivity and the transparency. How much is how much, right? So it's a constant struggle. Now, going concretely, I think we do fund both legal aid as well as anti-burnout activities, as we're calling it, and I also have to think about, as Chris was saying, okay, we fund sabbaticals for NGOs, and how much is actually, what does it lead to? Right? What is the strategic achievement of it? Okay, right? So yes, I fully agree, and we want to be flexible, and we actually do fund it here as well, Poland and in Hungary too, and that's a constant challenge for us, how to communicate that up. that into the framework. But I'll give you one example, legal aid, Hungary. We have been funding it big time, and I have to say that the actual achievement is that those organizations who are providing legal aid in certain regions, they are much more embedded. They have much stronger constituency in those regions than elsewhere. That's a clear correlation between the two. And that is already I would say, important achievement, which is possible to communicate, and obviously this funding is well justified because of that.
Do you have anything to add, Chris?
Well, maybe just real quick. So Balázs mentioned, work on legal aid, and USAID you can do, work on, supporting kind of the recuperation or rebuilding the resilience of civil society. Sometimes we have to tweak the grants, right? I mean, we can't just say, oh, we're sending some people off to a hotel for 5 days, but we could say, oh, well, we're sending them off to a hotel for a conference, and only has one agenda item on day 2. So sometimes we have to play with it a little bit in order to achieve those kinds of things. But yeah, no, I think in these kinds of, I think that's one of the, I was just going to note, and I hate to keep talking about more challenges because you always want like a solution or something, but from the donor perspective, you can also have, you have organizations that need money, right? Things cost money for sure. And then you have these services that can be provided to those organizations that would cost those organizations money, like legal aid or, or rest and recuperation, or, we've been talking about cybersecurity is another one, or cyber hygiene, and then, how do you defend yourself against attacks? And then, of course, and it's legal aid not just for civil society organizations, but independent media. And I think those services are great. And then that's the value of these coalitions as well, because then you can connect them if you have an adequate source of this kind of support to a greater variety of organizations. But it costs money. And then the other question is, so how much do you invest in that versus you invest in an individual organization to get their objective and achievement?
Thanks. Maybe next year we'll have a session on creative budgeting and how to disguise your in-house therapist as a program manager. But thank you all. I think all three of you alluded to the fact that you either as donors have donors or are accountable to other authorities when it comes to how finances are allocated. And so maybe to speak to a little bit of a positive note, what are grantees doing that is helping you make the case for why funding this region? Is it their investments in communications or branding, or is there anything that's particularly helpful when you're trying to sort of highlight or demonstrate the accomplishments of the groups that you're funding? Do you want to start?
Sure. So, as I mentioned, when you get into, many different partners doing many different things, but they're kind of on certain areas. I think, as Eva was mentioning here, a lot of this is what I would call the push, right? It's getting out there, I remember this from climate change and personal experiences, right? When 20 years ago, talking about climate change, it was going nowhere, right? But every time you had a meeting, you talked about climate change. And then, after the 10th meeting, someone else in that meeting went off and had another meeting and mentioned the word climate change. And it's just like this, there's an effect of engagement on any issue that kind of just brings it to the attention of others. And I think that's difficult. So, well, the indicator will be, oh, I had 700 meetings, and still no one knows what climate change is about. But but there is these elements of where you put an indicator on there. We slowed this down, or we pushed that forward, and connect that to each one of those. And sometimes it's hard to say, but a lot of times when you get a grant in front of you, or when we get results from a grant, I have to admit that I rarely ever look at the indicators, right? And the reason is because it's almost like you have to have a feeling as to whether or not this thing is working or not, right? Are we making a difference or not? And then the examples that are most important when you're on the Hill talking to people in Congress, or you're trying to convince the NSC that there's a big area they need to focus on in Central Europe, it's a story, right? I don't go and say, oh yes, and we trained 647 people, and nobody seems to, that doesn't seem to sway anybody. These individual stories, or this, if not, then statements, I think are the key. I think we have lots of those examples A lot of them come out of the independent media space, actually, where you might be working with different organizations, or you can point to an independent media organization that broke a story that maybe they got the information from somewhere else or from another civil society organization. With the advocacy work, when you get the attention of like-minded embassy groups or the EU does some kind of infringement process, the amount of information that you all have from engaging at all sorts of levels in society, that kind of information, when it bubbles up, is what basically policymakers use when they're making decisions. But what we're not doing, or what you're not doing, is taking credit for that information, right? Hey, we have this, we informed this, because we said this, somebody listened, or it was said again. And those kinds of things really help me tell that story to other people, and they're simple enough that they can be picked up in just a quick conversation to the next conversation, and then it creates that push, that sort of, I don't know what you call that, the sort of information effect. I was going to say, it's like misinformation and disinformation, but positive, so.
Eva?
The question is what the grantees are doing well.
Sure. I mean, I think in the framework of
Our grantees?
helping make the
All of
case
it.
for.
So it's very, very difficult for me to say what they are not doing well. I would say rather something different. I mean, the problem is that the grantees are very good at their activity. And the problem is that if they were to choose, should we invest in our capacity building, or should we provide services and work for those that we are serving, or those who are our recipients, they would choose the second one. And why? Because there's so scarce money. And then we have this kind of complaint: you do not communicate well enough about your results. Of course, no, because we do not have resources for that, because we prefer to do work than to communicate about it, because then there is no time to communicate. There is no time to report. After October 15, I've been talking with so many people. We should produce a report that would show, manifest, demonstrate with data, with stories, that it has been our achievement, our hard 8 years work that brought the success of these elections. And we are a year after, and the report is not ready. Why? Nobody had time for it, because immediately after we started to work with this government, that was not that easy to listen to us. The moment they win, suddenly there were problems, obstacles, and we are not that interesting to be at the stakeholders meeting and to be listened to. So, and then there came also kind of really delayed exhaustion. The moment that you are not on the front line, then you felt suddenly how tired you are. So I would rather say what we are bad at, because and not what the grantees are bad at. They are really our grantees. I cannot name. Maybe there are some exceptions, like because when they are really looking for money, not for work. This also happens, especially with public funds. But the grantees that we had a long track record of history. And what they do it well. The problem is they don't have enough resources, not enough people to focus on communication, storytelling, and making kind of use of the knowledge that they learn to share it with others. So that's why I believe this coalitions networking is like the buzzword for the next for the next future, because we have to really have opportunity to learn from one another what we managed to really learn through this process, and not only share resources but also share experiences and share different kind of capacities and capabilities, because we have different skills, and also to let's say to introduce to these networks those organizations, grassroots from outside big cities that had not this kind of opportunity, and the best way for them to profit, to benefit and learn is from the bigger ones that went through this process. So yes, our grantees are doing everything well, and if they had more money, they will do it better.
It's a very nice grassroots perspective. Thank you. No, I fully agree, actually, and I also wanted to, like, in our firm, formally in our case, Dexys, USAID implementer, we have a very clear hierarchy. We are in between the local organizations and USAID to actually pick up give out the grants, support, and put the direction, But at the same time, I also do not expect from the local organizations to, communicate the results in a way that I don't need to do it, right? I mean, don't do my job. I mean, I'm happy to do my job. That's exactly what I think is our job is as an implementer in between. This is in this way, and on the way to USAID, go back with the necessary results in this political as well as development framework. Now, this being said, I also fully agree that if I was speaking about coalition, I would actually emphasize constituencies. There's one thing which I would like to see more is a more professional approach to constituency building. Coalitions are great, I'm not, fully agree. And we kind of also realizing that communication is important because of the 21st century, and that's another additional layer, but then it must come with resources, because people who are busy with doing the activities, it's impossible to expect like, turn into a communication guru as well in your free time, right? It's just not gonna happen. So if we're keen to help the NGOs, then it's actually we should come with the resources to do this. That's why we kind of trying to do creative sector engagement, making sure that we have the resources for bringing in the professionals who can help those NGOs, and that is a different ballgame. I would say that's additional assistance and really helping the organizations, because it's not, again, like how I can reduce my time and activities and increase the communication, but I have the extra help on the communication from outside.
Yeah, I strongly support this constituency building, or rootedness, whatever you call it. And also, when I'm talking coalition, not only coalition, it's network. Network, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to create some formal or informal coalition, but that you really network, and that you build alliances with unusual actors and stakeholders within the sector, but also outside sector, with trade unions, with businesses, with academia, with influencers, with media, with even individuals. Basically, that you do not work in silos, but that you open up, especially that in the last years with COVID, with Ukraine, we've noticed that civil society, it's not civil society organizations, it's not third sector, it's much more. These times proved also that businesses are a part of civil society sometimes. Especially during the COVID era, a lot of them were working the sector hand by hand with the civil society organization, but even some of them were much better and faster. And we can learn a lot from business, and business can learn a lot from us. Building unusual alliances and building constituency, I agree, because it's the only way to show that you are relevant. But in order to do it, you have to have money to communicate. And for outreach, and to reach out to those that can be your constituency. And without this constituency, you become meaningless, because you have to have support, especially at the moment of attack. There should be people that will know about you and that will support you and that will fight for you. So I strongly support your point.
Please.
Yeah, no, I think this is a great conversation. I mean, I was thinking about so many things when you guys were talking. One is this, this idea of legal services or supporting on SLAP or cyber or whatever it may be, and this idea of communications and coalitions or networks or constituencies that you can provide levels of communication. And you're mentioning of the election, right? So I just, in my mind, one thing to note is once you have money, like in a government system, everybody wants it, right? So so as soon as you have the money, everybody wants it. So they, not from outside of the government, but within the government, right? Well, my program is better, or this thing is happening, or the Congo needs it, or whatever, right? So it's so we find ourselves in a constant defensive crouch, oh yes, but we did something. And actually, the Polish elections came up quite often, because you'd be in these moments of heat and be like, well, look what happened in Poland, it's working, and but then people start asking questions about well, what did you do? And I'm like, well, we supported, we did a lot. I mean, we supported a lot of organizations that did a lot, and there was a lot of people that we didn't even have relationships with that did a whole lot more, right? And it was like this sort of group effort that did it, but it's a success story overall for civil society, and how do you get there, right? It's kind of like we were talking before about, in Hungary, the argument as well, there's democratic backsliding and the space is closing, so you have failed. Or you could flip that completely on its head and say, there's been a relatively repressive environment for civil society for 14 years, and civil society still exists. It's there, it's vibrant, it's thriving, right? And so like, and it's just how you like communicate that, but to be able to do it at an like a higher level, right? To capture all, I mean, all of civil society, but you know, but kind of like the aggregate effect of civil society, I think is super important for like just to people, so people can recognize that this is what civil society does. All the individual varied pieces of it accounts for this kind of thing in moving societies one way or another.
Wonderful, thank you. Really, all your remarks have been fantastic so far. I do want to open it up for questions. We have about 10 minutes remaining. Because we only have one microphone, I will ask that maybe you just stand up and announce yourself.
What's happening with America?
Do it loudly.
Rather than waiting for the mic. So, does anyone, Zsofie, please?
Hi, Zosia Rutkiewicz, Political Accountability Foundation. I work on elections, on nonpartisan election monitoring, and I cannot tell you how many times I've heard that we're not going to fund your work because that's one step away from election interference. So I wanted to ask you about what is your take on policy, partisanship, and political, on those different lenses, and what is your take on that, and how does that help in safeguarding and expanding civic space in this particular region? Thank you.
Yeah. So you know, actually, when I was thinking about doing this panel, what I was going to say in this panel today, I was thinking, is it Elizabeth yesterday in the beginning of the political discussion? She was mentioning, you know, the issue of polarization in society. You know, almost kind of like, you know, do you pick a side or not pick a side? And let me just note, and so Balázs and Dexys and actually NDI as well are part of this regional project for USAID, right? And it was kind of like structured in that way in a regional project because we did not want to, you can move in and out of a country, but it wasn't about one country, right? You know, the United States is not making a judgment call on Poland or a judgment call on Hungary. It was like democracy writ large in the region. And it's so challenging at the individual embassy level because there's so many different relationships, right? Like, you know, in a polarized society like Poland, you know, on one end you have the President of the United States, you know, creating the Summit for Democracies and, you know, like, hey, listen, we got a problem, we got to really fix this, right? And then on the other hand, you have people that are essentially attacking democracy, you know, or dismantling it in front of you. And then you have these other interests that they're playing. Election interference becomes a big deal, you know, when it gets up close up to it. And for two reasons. One is, you know, when you get closer to the election, particularly, and it was happening in Poland, you know, I mean, both parties basically said, you know, the United States was supporting the other, right? You know, and you know, and you go to Hungary and it's all about, you know, U.S. intelligence services are swaying, you know, dark money, you know, into the, you know, I mean, it's just all over the place. And so you try to stand away from that. But what I find, unfortunately, is it also creates this opportunity for inaction, right? For like, I mean, I've been in these conversations where you're trying to come up with what is the message from the U.S. government in this particular space, right? If you go too far that way, you get nailed by one thing, and you go too far the other way, you know, et cetera. But really what you're just trying to say is, hey, we want to support you in a free and fair election and have democracy go forward. I mean, that's the, you know, that's the principal message. But you know, since both parties are stealing, I mean, this is what's happening in the U.S., right? I mean, like the game that's going on between, you know, Donald Trump saying they're weaponizing the justice system, you know, against him, and you know, it's just so easy, right, to get embroiled in that stuff. But from yesterday's conversation, all afternoon, I was like, you know, but like, did the United States pick a side? And this is just Chris Abrams' view, right? You know, and in theory, you know, the United States picked the side of supporting democracy, right? And we should support democracy. We have a commitment to it. It's what we believe in. And so when we see something that's clearly anti-democratic and don't make a statement on it, you know, or don't engage, you know, more proactively on our values, I feel like sometimes we lose a lot, right? And, you know, the United States, you know, contrary to, well, actually, no one believes this, but you know, we're not all powerful and all that kind of stuff, right? But like in the case of like Hungary, I feel like this 14 years of Fidesz I feel like at least, maybe could have been prevented a little bit if there was a little more active engagement by not just the United States, but also the EU. EU faces the same problem.
First of all.
Yeah. It's kind of like, oh, well, we don't want to, we want to make sure we maintain a relationship with the Hungarian people. Oh, they're good, part of NATO, good defense relationship. Like there's a lot of this kind of stuff. And it's just little things that start to add up to bigger things. And then pretty soon it's a bigger problem that's harder to fix than it ever was before. And that kind of, I don't know what you call that. Like it's just sort of avoidance of the direct issue at that time. So that was a long answer to your question, but it was just something that's been spinning in my mind. But sorry, I don't want to.
Please, that's okay.
So I went back to Washington for, we have these mission director conferences. They bring everybody from around the world, and basically, so our administrator Power and then Secretary Blinken, and everyone's talking to us, and there's this concept going on in Washington called an inflection point, right? And I think everybody is looking at sort of the world. I mean, the world, it's not very positive in a lot of ways right now. If you just read the front page of papers, there's this massive, great power competition going on. The United States is trying to figure out what its role in the world is, or should be, or shouldn't be. And, we have all sorts of problems with, our own democratic governance system. And then, you have the war in Ukraine, and you have Russian aggression, and you've got what's going on in Israel and Gaza, and, and then other places around the world. And all of a sudden, everyone's like, well, it's at an inflection point. And people are talking about, is this the end of liberal, sort of the liberal international order, and what's happening? What are we going to do with this? And so my question is, okay, so that's great. I heard this, like 10 different meetings. I'm like, so what are we doing about it, right? Like what's what's the plan? But what I'm getting at is I do get this feeling, particularly between autocracy and democracy, that there's going to have to be a moment where you choose a side, and you have to push one, or either have to try to stop one and push the other, or you're just not in the game at all. But it's just taking so long to get there that it's going to maybe eventually. So we'll see.
Let's go collect a few more questions. And maybe since we're short on time, let's go ahead and please stand up, and we'll take 2 or 3 before we turn back to our speakers.
The mic, or
We can hear you.
We can hear you.
We can hear you. Yeah.
So thank you for this excellent panel. I don't take it for granted. I don't think it's, by default that such conference has a separate section on donors, non-donors dialogue, but I'm still very close to you because I have kind of split identity. I'm one of the co-founders of the Feminist Fund in Poland, which is a community-led, power-shifting, trust-based grant maker, but I primarily consider myself as part of the feminist movement, and my background is in social justice movements. So I really welcome the information that USAID is trying to build again its presence in the region. I think it's so critical. And I think especially Poland now is in a very, civil society organizations are in a very vulnerable position because Poland is not perceived as a crisis geography anymore. And there's a threat, there's a real threat that the story of the late 90s and early 2000s will repeat itself. This is when many US private foundations retreated rapidly from the country because Poland was accessing the European Union, so everyone was like, okay, we're done here, they're on the right track, which is not exactly, and we know now what happened. So now after this after we managed to reverse the decline of democracy, I'm really worried about the funding landscape. And I think that it's critical that we sustain this resistance. So it's great news that there will be some kind of support. And what really resonated for me in this discussion, what was very important, is how we understand change. And many of things that you said kind of resonated for me. What is our theory of change? And for me, it's also a matter of dismantling white supremacy culture, because when we impose like rigid ideas or over focus only on measurable impact, and we are like imposing this on realities that are fluid and complex, it has serious limitations. So I think that these 8 years in Poland, this was not a wasted time, and for me the systemic level change is just the last stage of change. because the readiness for change was there at the community, at the grassroots level. So the only legitimate change probably is when it's built from the ground up, and this is what civil society organizations do. And I also wanted to use this space because there was one information which was missing for me to understand the funding landscape in the region. Sorry, I just didn't get, I don't think that there was a proper introduction of what is the role of Dexis Consulting in Poland, in other countries, Hungary, Bulgaria, because I've never heard of these groups.
You see, our communication is not exactly starting, but
yeah, so I'm very curious to understand what is your role, how you understand the role in these three countries, whatsoever.
Okay. And Peter, I saw your hand up. Maybe.
Thank you very much for the panel. My name is Peter Žuroš, I'm from Gajdovic in Slovakia. This question might be for all three of you. Considering the shift in the situation in Slovakia, are you planning to start supporting activities in Slovakia? And in case you already are you planning to strengthen the support of activities in Slovakia in foreseeable future? Thank you.
And maybe Jacek?
Yes, Jacek Kucharczyk, Institute of Public Affairs. First of all, it was a great panel and great, very illuminating discussion, and thanks for moderating it so well. I wanted to acknowledge one thing that Eva Kulik-Bielinska said at the very beginning about moving from project grants based on giving the detailed accounts on how you spend your money to grants where you basically give account of what you achieved, and we've been part of this process, and I think it's a great direction to change, the donor's perspective, but also grantee's perspective. And my question is to the other panelists: would you consider it possible that USAID or implementers move from this philosophy of giving even like sub-grants to organizations and basically giving a lump sum of money and then in return asking just for accounting on what you achieved with this money, but rather than asking for receipts for tram tickets and so on and so forth, as is often the case with some grant makers.
And I see one very enthusiastic hand from SOS for Education. So, final question.
It's not a question, it's a short comment. Don't leave us.
It's not a comment, it's
Definitely.
And also on the question of communication, we are not good at communication because of the lack of resources, because of the lack of tradition, because of the lack of professionalism in communication in NGOs. It's in the coalition that I represent SOS for Education, and I think we also need a program for politicians who go into power and then they are not able to acknowledge that the ideas, the project, the programs they take were created by civil society organizations. They tell us, you shouldn't complain, we are doing what we wanted, but they never said it openly. They want to take all the credit to themselves. And I think it's a pity and a big loss also for them. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. I think most easily. Balázs, if you want a quick minute on Dexis's posture in the region.
Actually, I wanted to say that I'm happy to give you my card, and we have a very cool web page. But to be frank, and this is what, I have an issue that I would like to be more transparent than we are. But the political sensitivity and all this is an issue for all. We're funding rule of law related civil society projects in these three countries, plus a lot of civic education, and now we're going to move into more communication as well, and here in Poland, for example, supporting mostly the restoration of rule of law process. So, yeah. When it comes to Slovakia, because yes, when
devastation of the rule of law in Poland.
Thank you. I think I said restoration. Okay. When it comes to Slovakia, I will answer a little bit from my perspective. I'm from Slovakia, I was in DC last week, We had talked a lot about Slovakia, and also in the previous few months, even years, we have been discussing it with USAID colleagues a lot. My original take when the government and the new Fico government came back, that after the elections, that A, it was almost inevitable based on what happened in a few years. B, I don't worry about civil society because they're gonna figure out what is happening. C, we're actually gonna have some Slovak consultants for the Hungarian organizations when it comes to campaigning and communication, because I think it's much more important than vice versa. Resources, and I would leave that to Chris, it's going to be scarce, but I know that some of the key donor mechanisms and also already started to focus on Slovakia as well, but it's not going to be a big influx of resources, obviously. And I also do think that this is for a longer run, not necessarily for a long one, but a longer one, and the country needs to go for it. I mean, it's not, you know, I think it's inevitable, but I was very impressed by your presentation, so I think things are fine. I mean, things are okay.
Do you have anything on Slovakia?
Yeah, or maybe I can answer. I can try to answer a couple questions,
Okay,
maybe
sure.
at once if I remember them all. So on Poland and Slovakia, right? So two things from me, I guess. One is that so when we look at the overall region of Central Europe, right? You know, it's important, writ large, right? When it comes to Poland and Slovakia, Hungary and Romania, it's very important because they have borders with Ukraine, right? And I know that, you know, the issues are separate and different, but from the budget perspective or from the U.S. government perspective, like Poland is super important to the United States right now, right? And Slovakia is actually very important. You know, it's a small country, smaller, right? But it's what happens in Slovakia is very important to the United States and Hungary and Romania. I mean, for different reasons and different goes. In the budget discussion that Balázs was mentioning in Washington, the challenge that we have is that this congressional earmark, you know, it's basically dependent on like a sentence inside, you know, one big bill. That kind of went away for 1 year. We think it's coming back in the following year. But then also we've been spending a lot of time with, you know, Hill staffers and everybody else trying to get this thing worked out. And then also how this overall U.S. government's support to Ukraine should also be spent to some extent in Central Europe for geopolitical purposes, for cross-border support to Ukraine, and also for the fact that if you're going to succeed in Ukraine and Moldova, you have to have partners in Central Europe. On Poland, I think we've been making the case that Poland is one of the priorities to support because it's of what's happened in the last few years, right? Because, and the reason for that is, one, is that Poland has an, you know, the Visegrad 4, or, you know, has an impact in the overall region, but that they're an important partner for us, and it's an extraordinarily important model about how you go about restoring from devastation, or you know, how does a country do this, right? You know, like you know, how do you go from, you know, a long period of time where things were clearly going in the wrong direction, stop it, and then try to rebuild in a way that's sustained, I guess. And the challenge is still there, right? And in some ways, right, like it gets more competitive in some ways, right? You know, like, you know, one group wins, the other group wins, and the next time the fight's going to be tougher, right? You know, kind of thing. So Poland, Slovakia, and you know, Poland, Hungary are clearly the priorities. Slovakia is coming, and we're going to start working with independent media in Slovakia to start. But we've made a pitch for more resources for all three of those, including, you know, we'd still like to continue to work in Bulgaria, and then we have a little bit of work in Romania. And then the other one on our horizon is the Czech Republic going forward. And sorry, I can't remember your question.
Yeah, I was going to say, before you hand back the mic, anything on moving from project-based funding to lump sum granting?
I think it's a great idea, honestly. You know, I think
We could give some training.
Yeah, that's right. No, but you know what we do is we do have this process called, it's basically a statement of objectives, you know, where we just ask people to, here's the U.S. government's objective, you say it's objective here, and then you go achieve the objective. I mean, the challenge in that is the definition and phrase, you know, so a lot of times there'll be like milestones, right? When you achieve this objective, we will give you this much money. So the definition of those milestones becomes like a very intense, you know, cerebral thing. But we do work a lot with coalitions, though likely what will happen is you have to choose one organization that will manage the money throughout to the other groups, but it could be a coalition writ large. And if there's agreements in place between them, and if it's based on the subjectives approach, in theory, you can minimize sort of the bureaucracy and just deliver. The other option is to find an organization that can receive money. There's this process in the US government called a PAWD, which is a program accomplished upon disbursement.
Upon what?
Program accomplished upon disbursement. I don't
Uh-huh.
know. Yeah, and but it could
Catchy.
be. Yeah. But the argument is that the money is transferred, and we just effectively, it's like going shopping in the store, right? You know, we have $10 million, and we just bought $10 million worth of democratic objectives in Central Europe, working with this organization. But it's not that simple, but in a way, it does provide some way of kind of, because we all get caught up in the, what about on page 57? And what about the, did we certify that we aren't funding terrorist organizations? I mean, all this stuff that comes up, right? That we need to sort of sort out, and definitely need to shelter, your civil society organization, really trying to work on something in a local town here in Poland does not really, should not be having to answer questions about, the Bumpers Act in the United States kind of thing, so.
Thank you. And maybe, Eva, any final comments on the question about funding mechanisms? I know you spoke a little bit about it already, or in response to anything on Poland.
I can add a little bit on Slovakia too.
Oh, please.
You wouldn't expect that. We just got information that we were selected to be an operator of CERV, Citizens Equality Rights and Values program, actually on two such programs, one focused on Poland, and another one focused on Slovakia,
Great news.
Hungary, Czechia, and Poland. So here comes the news that some of the money will be distributed very, but not from the Battery Foundation, but the consortium. Yeah. Yes, and I hope that we are going to cooperate with our colleagues from Slovakia in the next programming period from EA grants. So another kind of opportunity. A lot of learning processes were there when we were working in a consortium from different EU countries. Exchanging, views and opportunities, but also giving grants for some small regional or bilateral projects. So I hope this is something that will continue. Talking about, from the perspective of donor and grant maker, we are going to continue different kinds of grant making categories in our kind of portfolio. Very certain are going to be core grants. That's grants not for activities, particular activities, not for projects, but for the mission, for the kind of main activity of the organization. And it's a little bit coming back to the 1980s, and 89s, and 1990s. That's what we've been doing, because it was the time when the civil society organizations were emerging, and they had some statutory purposes which we just funded. And then with the EU funds and also, this kind of obsession of the donors that they want each project to be attributed to their funding, suddenly the organizations became really a kind of patchwork of projects, not the organization with some clear mission. When you look at their websites, you were not aware what they are doing, except a plethora of projects. So I hope that that's something which is going to change now because of the scarcity of money, that the donors and the grant makers would understand that in order to have an outcome, they have to fund one project, several of them. Of course, it's not about double funding. It's about pooling sources in order to have better, basically an achievement. Because with this little money, $20 million per 1 year for Poland, what is it? Peanuts. You cannot compare it with I don't know, one company is spending on their PR activities. So I think this is kind of the future that we have to somehow acknowledge, that we have to fund the organizations as a whole, not as a particular kind of element of it. And it will also help them to really develop and to specialize in what they are good at. Especially that you know, the surroundings are so complex that you cannot just, you know, do some little thing and expect big results. You have really to focus hard in order to get this result and outcome. A challenge for us, grant makers, will be evaluation of the proposals. With AI, which you can prompt in a way that it would, produce a proposal with an angle to have a favorable eye of the evaluators. Because really you can prompt it in such a way that it will say, okay, it's the Stefan Batory Foundation on board, they have this and this and that, or for the grant making, among grant making experts, they have those and that. Write this proposal that will do this, that, and that they will find it interesting. So really this kind of evaluation that is being emphasized on by the public donors, you especially, that is two independent experts reading it separately, not talking to one another, not talking to the grantee, not asking questions, just basing its assessment on reading this piece of paper, you are totally lost.
Yeah.
So really, I think this is kind of a revolution that is in front of us, something that Batory Foundation has been doing for years with its own money, that is we are talking to the grantees. Of course, there is a concept note with, you know, not very kind of detailed budget, but basically the whole idea, what you want to spend it for. Then we have a conversation, and in this conversation, we learn that it's them who has written it, not some consultant. And then we can clarify some ambiguities. Also, we can direct the conversation away the dialogue, asking questions that helps people to think maybe it wasn't the way to put it, maybe we should do something different. Another thing I think we have to do is really ask the grantees when they apply, the applicants, have they scanned the landscape? Are there others who are doing exactly the same thing? Because I can see more and more, this is something just fighting with this kind of, you know, competing mindset, that you have to be aware that others are doing exactly the same. So maybe you should have a different angle to, you know, a different approach to really make a difference. Or maybe you could join the sources, the forces. So this is kind of another thing that I think we are going to introduce. That's an element of a diagnosis of what we are doing. It. Do you know who else is doing it? What difference we are going to do, or how your idea is going to, what kind of added value it's going to have, you know, to really contribute to the change.
Thank you, and I know we're over time, so thank you all for your patience. You know, it's a really simple statement, but it stuck out to me. It's just the remarks that, you know, everything that everyone is doing is already remarkable, and you've all demonstrated that more leads to more. And so I think it's really our priority and our mission to not punish those successes and see this collaborations move forward. So with that, please join me in thanking our panelists. Just a quick applause for them.